Today we're going to talk about the Supreme Court's bombshell announcement about the question of Trump's disqualification from the Colorado ballot, and I interview former CNN host Brian Stelter about the future of Fox News, Tucker Carlson, and whether covering the right has ever impacted his own safety. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're watching No Lie. We've got major news out of the Supreme Court. They have granted the petition for review of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision disqualifying Donald Trump from the ballot based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And we've spoken about this case a lot. Obviously, the implications of Donald Trump being permanently taken off the ballot aren't escaping anyone. But here's the point that I think is worth making. And this is for Democrats just as much as it's for Republicans. Would it be one of, if not the biggest Supreme Court rulings of our lifetime if they uphold the lower court's ruling that Trump is ineligible to serve as president? Of course. I don't doubt that for a second, and obviously the implications for the election would be massive. It would mean, in an instant, that Trump's political career is over. And in an era where one party's identity is wholly predicated on its fealty to that person, the significance of that move obviously can't be overstated. But here's what's more important. The implications of the Supreme Court ignoring the plain text of the Constitution in deference to Donald Trump. If the Supreme Court reverses the lower court's ruling and allows Trump to remain on the ballot, it is effectively saying that Trump is above the Constitution. Remember, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is clear. It says that no one who's engaged in or aided those who've engaged in insurrection are eligible to serve in office. Trump was found to have engaged in insurrection. A trial court in California found this much after hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence. That was Judge Carter. A trial court also found in Colorado the same thing. That was Judge Wallace. The Colorado Supreme Court agreed with the lower court's ruling in that state, also finding that he engaged in insurrection. And grand juries found the same thing, that he also engaged in insurrection in Washington, D.C. by way of the probable cause standard, which is why that grand jury voted out the indictment in that case in the first place. And the grand jury in Georgia essentially found the same thing by way of the racketeering charge, which is why that indictment was voted out. So the facts of this case are beyond dispute. Donald Trump engaged in insurrection on January 6, 2021. And the Constitution's provision is beyond dispute as well. There's no ambiguity in the language barring an officer of the United States who's engaged in insurrection from serving again. And I know that Republicans are trying to parse words and pretend that somehow the president of the United States isn't an officer of the United States, which is a joke, or that the authors of the 14th Amendment went through all the trouble of barring insurrectionists from running for office and yet left a glaring loophole only for the most powerful office in the entire nation, which, again, is laughable on its face. So, again, the facts are beyond dispute. All that remains at this point is whether the Supreme Court will do its job by upholding the Constitution and its provisions. And it should go without saying, but just because the consequences of upholding the Constitution will be profound is not license to not uphold the Constitution. Will it be catastrophic? Of course it will be. But again, to my whole point, so will ignoring the Constitution just because it'll be impactful. It places one man above the Constitution. It'll make him a dictator. It will mean he isn't constrained by the same laws and rules as every other human being in this country. I tend to think that is a hell of a lot more profound because it's an abandonment of our most sacred foundational principles, our most sacred foundational values, that no one is above the law, that we don't have a king, that we don't have a dictator. So I will not be swayed into thinking that the Supreme Court should be too scared to act just because the consequences of a Trump disqualification will be too great. Donald Trump should have considered that when he incited an insurrection. He made that choice himself on January 6, 2021. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment had already been written 150 years earlier. This wasn't some surprise for Trump. No one sprung a 150-year-old amendment on him. So no, it is not the Supreme Court doing this to Trump. It's not the Democrats doing this to Trump. It's not Joe Biden doing this to Trump. It is no one other than Donald Trump himself that is being held responsible for his own actions. I get that Trump and his mouthpieces want nothing more than to blame everyone else, but Trump has agency. And in the same way that he chose to summon a mob to the Capitol on January 6th, he also chose the consequences that come with it. In the meantime, I want to be clear that for us, for those of us who care about protecting democracy, nothing changes regardless of how the Supreme Court rules. Whether he's disqualified or not, we continue to organize and stay engaged and vote. Because whether he's on the ballot or not, his influence still will be. And there are plenty of lunatics on the right who are more than willing to pick up the mantle and carry out the MAGA agenda. And deny the election results and remove us from NATO and kowtow to the Russians and usher in far-right rule for the United States. I promise you, they've all got the playbook by now. So we fight equally as hard regardless of what happens, because at the end of the day, we can't rely on the courts or the lawyers or the state parties or anyone. It is our responsibility to protect our democracy. We did it in 2020, we did it again in 22, we did it again in 2023, and this year, 2024, is absolutely no different. Here's a preview of my interview with Brian Stelter. Do you think that the $787 million lawsuit will have the effect of deterring Fox News from lying in the future? Or do you think that these massive sums of money are just, the cost of doing business? You called it a lying tax in the book. So is this not just built in?
Fellow Brian, that's the hard question. How much of this actually changes Fox's behavior? And I think the answer is that around the edges, it already has changed Fox's behavior. Around the edges, for example, they don't have Donald Trump call in on the phone anymore. They usually don't interview him live anymore. They tape the interviews. And that's literally because they're trying to limit their legal exposure and their legal liability. They can edit out any defamatory claims before air. So there are those examples of how these lawsuits have had an impact on the editorial, as well as, of course, the huge financial impact. And I think, honestly, the financial impact was the most severe. But going forward, I think we should be realistic about the fact that Fox's audience wants oftentimes to be deceived, wants to be comforted by a fantasy that Fox tells that's very far from reality. And, you mentioned a lying tax. I love that phrase. I saw Caroline Bueno, the disinformation researcher, use that phrase right when the Dominion settlement with Fox was announced. She said, look, Fox just paid a lying tax. They're going to probably have to pay more of those lying taxes when Smartmatic and other cases go around, and it's just the cost of doing business.
Well, another casualty of that $787 million Dominion lawsuit was Tucker's show on Fox. But if the lying tax was built in, then why would Fox also let go of its biggest star? Like, they've already paid the price, literally and figuratively, for Tucker's lies. So why not at least keep him and take advantage of his ratings?
It did all happen in that very short time period in April that makes up the core of my book. But I really don't believe Tucker Carlson's firing was directly related to Dominion. He has said that. He has tried to claim that. But I've interviewed a lot of people around this story, and I just don't think it adds up. I think Tucker Carlson was on the way out anyway. But what Dominion did do is Dominion dredged up why he was intolerable. Dominion forced Fox to look Carlson in the face, and really see who he was. A guy who was sending emails internally, calling female executives the C word, who was acting in ways that no boss would tolerate with any employee. He acted like he was untouchable. He acted like he was invincible. And so what the Dominion litigation did, because Dominion was able to read all the emails and read all the text messages, was it dredged up that intolerability and made the Fox board confront it. Now, why not keep him anyway? Why not keep on tolerating his intolerability? Well, I think Lachlan Murdoch and the Fox board, including Paul Ryan, they made a calculation that if they could bring Fox just a little bit, they could tone it down a little bit. If they could lower the temperature just a little bit on Fox, they would benefit economically and reputationally. And honestly, Brian, I think it's kind of worked. I think there's less scrutiny now of what the Fox primetime stars do. There's a little bit less of that, controversy stoking that happens on social media, even though the network is still unhinged every night.
To watch the full interview with Brian, click the thumbnail right here on the screen or check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel. You can also click the link on the screen for the audio version of this episode. And as always, to see more of my content, the subscribe button is on the screen as well.